ensure that I was paying attention yesterday, I want you to all know and maybe be horrified that I'm not tied to my phone. I have no phone on me. If something bad happens, I'll figure it out.
We'll all tell you.
Well, I mean, when I'm alone walking in the woods or something like that, or I drive into a ditch or something like that, right? If bad happens, we'll just get it figured out. But this is our special session, our student session. The reason I'm chairing the student section is in case anything were to go wrong with the technology, they know how to fix it. As opposed to guess where I go, yeah, I don't know, push a button until it works. So we're sticking with our theme, leadership and authenticity. And I think about authenticity as sort of truthful. So we're first going to see this presentation about corporate governance, and I think the leadership is pretty evident with that. And the authenticity is we're looking at, do the corporate governance structures allow for authentic reporting on financial statements and supporting? Because we know we need to rely on that in businesses. And that's going to be the leadoff guys. Then we're going to sort of stop, let our other moderator take over for a while, do some questions. Then we're going to switch to our second presentation, which we're going to jump out of the whole greedy world of business that needs all of you guys telling us what to do better and go to healthcare, right? A profession that's inherently ethical. And in that, we've got leadership, because we think we have maybe a lesson for leaders and policymakers related to healthcare based on doing some nice basic economics that only Ben really has to, now that Peter's here, only Ben and Peter really have to understand at the end. And it's authentic because saying, hey, this is what's really going on. So leaders, you need to know what's really going on to make this work. So gentlemen, are you ready?
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right, so we're doing corporate governance and its effect internationally.
So first we want to talk about what is corporate governance, and it's a system of which the board of directors takes control of the company and how they're going to make sure that what management wants to do goes throughout the entire company and everyone is following their more or less instructions. And setting the company's strategic aims so that people can find out what these goals are and do what they need to do in order to meet those goals. And then they also want to provide leadership for these people, so like a little bit of guidance here and there so that they can make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. And then supervising the management, the board wants to make sure that management's following the goals and helping the shareholders achieve what they want to achieve.
So looking into the purpose a little bit more, this presentation is meant to help give you an understanding of corporate governance in the United States and then compare the corporate governance in the United States with corporate governance standards in other countries, internationally. So we're gonna look at 5 countries today. 2 of these countries have very large capital markets. These countries are Japan and Germany. And then we're gonna look at the 3 most populated countries in Asia, China, India, and Indonesia.
So jumping into the US, clearly there has been some issues throughout the past, especially the Enron scandal and other major ones, especially recently, that have had brought into question what corporate governance means and how it's actually affecting businesses. So then when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed in 2002, following Enron, there were some major changes that took place. Company loans to executives were banned, and it gave job protection to these whistleblowers who would call out what upper management is doing wrong. And the independence and financial literacy of corporate boards were strengthened. And CEOs were held accountable for what their businesses were doing.
So now we're going to look at corporate governance in Japan. Japan has been improving their corporate governance in recent years, and there are 3 main issues Japan faces. The first being there's a lack of women representation at the management level. This is more a cultural issue in Japan. It's not as much like, you see it in other countries as well, but it's not as much something that there's like a direct answer for. This is more of like their culture and they're gonna have to figure this one out. The size of corporate boards are very large in Japan. A lot of these board of directors are above 20 people. And this makes it very difficult to have meaningful discussion when they all meet. And the structure of board committees is also an issue. A lot of CEOs are able to be on several committees that they should not be allowed to be on, like the compensation committee and other committees. So what does Japan need to fix? Relating to the lack of women representation, again, this is a cultural issue that Japan faces, and they're gonna need to work on this one on their own and sort of figure out their issues with that. Again, board sizes are far too large, and they need to be reduced to about 10 to 12 board members. This allows like more meaningful discussion, and actually in recent years, they have started to do this in some companies where they have decreased the size of the board. And CEOs, again, should not be allowed to be on committees like the nomination committee or the compensation committees. For obvious reasons, it leads to a conflict of interest. They would push for more money and they get to nominate who's on the board, which could lead to an independence problem.
And then jumping into Germany, they have a much different board of director system than we do. They have a management board who oversees what the company is doing, and then a supervisory board, which is voted on based on employees rather than shareholders. So they have a lot more say and they get to really influence the management board on what they're going to do. And then due to this, banks have fewer restrictions like in their government. And because of that, they are allowed to invest much more freely than they are in the US. So these banks are able to buy these shares of companies and then, or they're using holdings from the bank's clients to vote on their shares and influence these companies much more drastically than they ever could in the US. And that's referred to as block holding. And in 1986, 32 of the 100 largest companies in the German market were owned or held by banks. And this made up about a quarter of the German nominal capital throughout the entire country. And it also included 7 of the 10 largest firms. But since then, Germany's been moving farther away from this blockholder method that they've had, more towards a free float, which is where individual investors are able to have more of a say and it's not really banks being in charge. So they're moving more towards a Western idealization. And this is due to globalization and some tax law changes that Germany went through back in the very beginning of the 2000s that is decentralizing these banks from being able to do this block holding technique.
So moving into the corporate governance in China, China has developed policies to create Western-style oversight mechanisms and corporate governance in order to improve public confidence. However, the corporate governance in China still remains very weak. State shareholders have overwhelming favoritism compared to individual investors. And in China, they have 5 areas they need to progress in. The first one is there's an overwhelming concentration of state ownership. So although China doesn't, the government doesn't own nearly as many companies as they did in the past, they still own about two-thirds of the companies. So number 2, there's a lack of independence among the board of directors. Number 3 is there's a lot of insider trading. There are managers in some of these firms that they work with, and because some of these companies offer non-tradable funds, they have been able to take full advantage of stock offerings and they make a lot of money. And there's one well-known economist in China, and he is quoted saying that he believes that the stock market in China is casino without any regulations or rules. And there are also weak mechanisms to control false financial disclosures, and China suffers from immature capital markets. So looking at what China needs to fix, number 1, state ownership is overwhelming in China. As I said before, they still own about 2/3 of the companies. So they're easily able to manipulate the financial reports that are sent out. And there needs to be more individual ownership moving forward throughout the country. And the board of directors needs to establish a new culture in which they're independent from the company. What China allows right now, the dominant owner is able to select the board of directors. They're able to nominate themselves and pick the people that they want, which leads to a big independence issue on the board of directors. And a lot of these dominant owners are state-owned, which means the government is able to pick who gets onto the board. So there needs to be some sort of investigative process as well with insider trading, and insider trading needs to be punished in China. China needs to develop an idea similar to GAAP in order to better control this false information. And China needs to work on developing mature capital markets where investors have the ability to quickly and easily buy and sell assets at stable prices in order to fix their immature capital market.
And then jumping into India, there was this really big market boom in the mid to early 90s that allowed management from these Indian corporations to practically steal $2.2 billion from their local investors. And that accounted for almost 11 million investors who lost all this money. And while that happened a while ago, it still is an issue due to fraud, corruption, market manipulation, and other sources, because they're unable to rebuild this faith in their capital markets. And because of that, lots of small companies aren't able to get the funding they need in order to start up or grow their business. And another issue that's preventing them from having any sort of growth or changing these market problems is there's these corrupt politicians that their pockets are getting lined because of these corporations. So what they could do to fix this is create an independent and effective corporate governance institution to try and restore some credibility in these financial markets. And it's really hard to find independent directors in India because of the corruption that's going on. And there really haven't been any law changes since 2004, which hasn't really been able to help fix anything that's been going on there. And they're really struggling. And their biggest issue is they need to try and fix the confidence and restore investor confidence in these equity markets.
So looking into our last country, corporate governance in Indonesia, companies in Indonesia have not been managed properly, and these issues include the concentration of company owners is high, which means a lot of the money is in a very small population of Indonesia. So there's a very small population that has a lot of the money, and the majority of the population is very poor. The Board of Commissioners' supervisory function is ineffective, and this is largely due to the fact that there's not an independent structure there. There's a lack of transparency regarding company mergers and acquisitions procedures. There's too much of a dependence on external funding, and there's a lack of supervision by creditors. So what does Indonesia have to fix? The majority of wealth, again, is held by a very small population of Indonesia. They need to be able to spread out this wealth more evenly and more equally in order to really progress. The Board of Commissioners in Indonesia must be made up of independent individuals whose job it is to oversee internal controls. And another thing with this is this is a big cultural issue where a lot of these people have a sense of loyalty to the company. So they don't want to see it go down, they don't want to whistleblow, they don't want to do things like that. And then there's a big independence issue there. Full information must be disclosed when companies decide to merge or acquire smaller companies. This is a big deal because, I mean, there's never really they never know to the full extent what is going on when they do merge or when they purchase smaller companies. And external funding should be available, but it should not be relied on. A lot of these companies need to find better ways to manage their money and use it more efficiently instead of spending it all and then going and borrowing more. And creditors must have a larger role in supervising a company's transactions in relation to invoices and credit notes.
And then looking into our summary of what we discussed today, clearly Japan and Germany have more developed economic markets, and their corporate governance structure reflects that. That's why they're able to be a little bit more successful than a lot of these Eastern countries. Like Japan clearly needs to focus on reducing the size of their board and keeping the CEOs off all these committees that gives them even more jurisdiction. In Germany, there's clearly, they're making progress, but they still need to bring down the level of influence that these banks have on all these companies. And then on the Eastern front, China really needs to help reduce their government influence in these capital markets. And that would allow investors to have better opportunities with more probable returns rather than practically investing in junk bonds. And then India and Indonesia are pretty similar in where they're at. They have a lot of people at the bottom that aren't able to invest or make any money. And then these influential families at the top are able to pretty much do whatever they want because they control all of the wealth and are able to take over these financial markets and keep other people from gaining any power throughout the country due to all the fraud and issues they're having.
Okay, and then we have works cited. And that's.
Thank you guys so much for all of your insights and all your research and everything. I think we really focus on the United States and their corporate governance since we're in the US, but it's always important to look across the board and look at other countries, see what they're doing, and just make those different perspectives. And thank you for going in, seeing what they need to fix. That will just help us see what we need to fix. And those kind of perspectives just help us make better decisions. So awesome job. Thank you so much. I guess we have some time for questions. So anybody have questions, comments?
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, do you guys see any reason to think that China, India, Indonesia are interested in fixing any of this?
In recent years, I know China has tried to move towards a more Western style. I'm not sure how much they want to really fix it. I mean, they've owned and they've ran their companies for a long time. They like to have power. They like to have full control. They don't want to be seen as having bad companies or having failing companies. So I'm not quite sure as to how much they would want to fix it. I know more about Indonesia too. They have tried to a little bit. There was an economic downfall and they started recovering in 2002. That's when they started hearing about good corporate governance, and they've been trying to implement it more into their system, but they're still ranked very low in regards to other countries around them. So I think they're still trying to figure out a little bit more how to, but in regards to China, I'm not quite sure they really want to.
And then India is very similar. India is very similar to China in the fact that those in power don't want to give other people part of that power. And because of that, they're not really looking to make any changes, while many of the people at the bottom want to see changes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Have you thought about, or have you researched anything on how maybe we can have some influence in helping policy changes to happen there? Like one example I can think of, because you mentioned, for example, there's no women on the boards in Japan. Well, what can we do to help make that happen? For example? But
That's,
in Walmart, sorry, I'm interrupting you. You're the one who should talk. But at Walmart, for example, put pressure on their suppliers, and they go in and do audits or have audits done in those factories to make sure the employees are being treated in a certain way, and they won't do business with companies. They won't buy things from Chinese companies that aren't sourced in that way. So that's one example. But there are other ones you've thought.
I couldn't really see any way that we could help it because it's such a cultural thing. Like in Japan, it's more male dominated, and that's the acceptable practice there.
Mhm.
So I'm not really sure how much we could do to try and change that without insulting them by trying to say, hey, your culture is wrong.
Also, going along the lines of that too, I mean, I think these countries also, they need to want help. I don't know if us just stepping in and saying you should follow what we do would be the correct thing. I think it would make a lot of countries angry or upset, again, going along the lines of we're saying that what they're doing is wrong and follow us and we know what we're doing. I think these countries are gonna want our help, and we shouldn't just step in because it might cause some conflicts. Yes.
Yeah, somewhat along similar lines, and you've started to address it in your responses. I found it very interesting. It was really fascinating to see your comparisons of the different countries. But it also did come across very much as a US-centric approach to say, well, what do they need to fix? And almost the implication is certainly to be more like us. And I think if you step back, we don't like to do this, but if you step back, a lot of people would be pretty critical of the United States and of our capital markets and of our corporate governance, because there's a lot of questions about how much Sarbanes-Oxley actually helped. And so I just think it's important to, and I liked the way you discussed it, you know, you can't say to somebody else, well, you have to do it just like us, but maybe to understand where are there some lessons there for us in the United States to make our systems also more effective, because we've definitely got some things that we could do to improve our capital markets and our oversight.
Absolutely, like, we're clearly not perfect, we have our issues, and we don't believe that really we're the perfect way to do it. There's definitely other ways that are probably just as good, if not better, than how we are doing it. But each country has to kind of find their own way to do it that fits with their culture, if that makes sense.
Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. What's in the future for you two in terms of like what comes next, either research wise or professionally for you? I have to say that you.
Ask him if he has a job for you.
I just want to say, like, I just want to commend them for like coming out here as undergraduates and like presenting this research, and then you're like color coordinated even down. I was like, where can I sign the check to get this test? No, seriously. So what's next for you, research wise or otherwise?
Research wise, we just finished this, so I'm not quite sure. I'm sure there'll be something. And Professor Coate has really helped a lot with like this sort of research. And he sort of liked like this idea and then really pushed us to go further with it. So that really helped us. But in the future, I think auditing is what we're both looking at doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, like auditing and corporate governance are really close to like going hand in hand. I mean, like with good corporate governance, it improves audit quality. That's what I researched before. So I think we both want to look into auditing right now.
So I'll jump in a little background for them is they took the auditing course for MBA credit, and part of that requires a research requirement. So they had to do a paper. And John comes up with this paper. I said, well, you know what? I'll make a deal. You guys can co-work together if you present it, which is a lot harder than just writing the paper and giving it to me.
Yeah.
And so Matt was like, yeah, well, as long as it doesn't interfere with me DJing at the Burger. But they're like, okay, we're in it together. And so it really came out of the audit side of the value of information and the corporate governance side of information going to capital markets, making those capital markets more efficient. And then I said, well, it came in with this around the world. I'm like, man, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Because we just teach, here's the US rule, here's Sarbanes-Oxley, and we're supposed to be global. And I'm thinking, okay, I know China, Indonesia, they're big countries. I know they have lots of people in them, but you know some of their historical struggles, but you really don't know where they are. And I said, I thought that would be interesting to tell folks.
You should talk to Professor Kosmeta, because his job market paper is on corporate governance and corporate boards. So I think great faculty resource, maybe to take the research further and develop another paper.
Thank you.
You can go further with your, it's interesting base. So you can use factors that are common and do some statistical analysis of what is the common governance factors that are in each country and how does it affect the performance, for example, in each market, and see the difference. So you can, it's like the base is there, so just start to build with Joe, will help you a lot there, and if you need Ben, me, so whatever. The seed is there, so just water it.
All right, one last question from anybody, or we're gonna let Ally take over. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. Did you see how quickly she flew through those screens? Anything like that happened by any other participant? No.
Okay, so my name's Allison LeFaber. I'm a junior here at St. Bonaventure, and I'm pursuing an individualized major, which is combining health science and business courses. So for my soon-to-be capstone project thesis idea, I've been working with Coat and Professor Posmaniak about the current health crisis, which we all know about, the labor shortage, and we're looking at it through an economic model of analysis, so we can kind of let our policymakers understand what could we have done during COVID to improve upon our staffing and labor shortage. So our motivation and purpose behind this study, like I said, is the current health shortage using the basic economic labor market analysis. And this has been available to policymakers, but I don't think they've looked at it in depth as how we are to kind of reduce the labor shortage. And then we want to hopefully in the future do this analysis and then show it to the policymakers and show them how they could have avoided it. So what is the problem? Nursing shortage has always been a major issue because you can never technically really have enough nurses because they are the backbone of our healthcare community. And with the pressures of the pandemic, that also increased. And with demand increasing, supply decreases in nurses, especially through burnout, restrictions, and pay cuts that they are all facing, and it has a major effect on the economic structure of the hospital. We're also going to take a look at travel nurses and how their impact seemed to be good, but it actually has hurt the nursing market as a whole. So COVID's direct impact on healthcare, there was obviously a ton of operational and financial adjustments that came not only in healthcare but throughout our whole society during COVID. And the major, the major part of labor shortage is clinician burnout. And burnout has always been around, but COVID definitely pushed burnout on all of our healthcare workers, and including policy-based quarantine orders as well, with living with families and stuff. They don't want to bring anything home. Lockdowns also didn't make it any easier. And all in all, this reduces the high margin revenue sources for the hospitals with the canceling of elective surgeries, not having enough beds and other for non-COVID patients. So in this map, basically you can just see the states in orange are the states that have a nursing shortage of over 50% or more. And those are mainly, as you can see, like our rural states that no one really wants to go and move to work in a hospital, especially if they're going to be working overtime and not getting paid what they feel is a sufficient amount. And then the states in dark blue are kind of like, okay, they're like 30 to 50%. They definitely could improve. And the states in light blue are under 15%. So those ones we don't have to worry about as much, but still 15% is a large amount for nursing labor shortage. So another thing that a lot of us probably have been seeing is bed shortage all over the news throughout COVID. And when they're talking about bed shortage, they actually are referring to the number of staff, not actual beds. So there is a sufficient amount of beds, but there's not a sufficient amount of staff to take care of the people in those beds. And this leads to a number of patients being turned away or hospitals choosing who they can and cannot take care of. COVID-19 has obviously exhausted many resources, and there's no way to admit patients if we don't have staff and nurses to take care of them. So if a regular nurse on a day-to-day basis, she has 4 to 5 patients, but then COVID pushing the amount of patients coming in turns to 9 or 10, she's not going to be able to give them, he or she is not going to be able to give them the adequate care that they want to because they are overloaded. And so that's why they ended up having to turn people away, saying there was a bed shortage. So the main point of this too is burnout in nursing. 60% of acute nurses are experiencing burnout. The American Medical Association did a recent survey that came out in March that this stat came from, and then it also said 89% of these nurses are experiencing a labor shortage at their hospital. And that's like a very high amount. But the burnout symptoms, the main reason in that survey that they found was the inability to deliver quality care, insufficient staffing, increase in bullying by superiors in the workplace, and judgment from family and peers. What I mean by the inability to deliver quality care is these people feel that they weren't given the right training, supplies, like support that they needed to be able to help these people during COVID. Because if you need to take care of yourself while you're taking care of others. Nurses are people too, and they kind of felt this increasing daily, and a lot of them not wanting to work their jobs anymore. So now we're gonna get into the economic analysis of what we're doing. So I'm gonna show you a few different graphs that Miko and Ben put together, showing the demand supply. These aren't linear graphs in real life, but for the point of this PowerPoint and research, kind of showing them in just a linear way to make it more understandable. But so COVID-19 obviously increased the demand for nurses. So in our first graph to the left, we have our equilibrium points. So we have our demand, decrease, supply, increase lines, and then we have our equilibrium point with the amount of labor and the wages that would be paid for a basic labor market. Then as COVID hit, the first few weeks, we have a major increase for the demand on nurses. And as you see, that increases their hours, but also should increase their wages. These nurses were probably in contract and stuff, so to solve this issue, they started paying overtime. But you can't really pay overtime forever, and nurses aren't gonna wanna work up to 60 hours a week, every single week. So then, now, the nurses, after the 2-week period, which they thought COVID was going to be, they realized that it's not going anywhere, and they start to feel the effects of this burnout that I was speaking of before. And as they feel the effects of the burnout, the supply of nurses is going to decrease because they're exhausted, they're overworked, they can't handle it, they don't feel appreciated. So this was our previous graph we just looked at when the first 2 weeks, like I said, the COVID demand increased. And then as we see the supply also increase with this, and we kind of get this, as Co likes to call it, the death spiral. So we have our basic labor economic, then we have our overtime workers, but then we have these high wages that would need to be paid in order to meet the amount of labor these nurses are putting in, which they're not really, the hospitals can't really afford to do that, and they're not really looking to do that. So then you have nurses just leaving. They're like, I'm not gonna do this anymore, what's the point? I'm not getting paid, I'm not being appreciated. And then to try to solve this nursing shortage throughout the country, we start looking into travel nurses. And I don't know if everyone's heard of what a travel nurse is, but they go on contracts where they spend probably 2 to 3 months in another place where they don't live, and they work at a hospital, kind of like a step-in. So kind of like a substitute teacher, like a long-term sub is the way I think of it. And so then after they're done, they take like a month off, they get a really nice break, and then they move to another hospital. But they also get paid more for living somewhere else besides their home where they'd like to live. And so these benefits are outweighing those of residential nurses. So in this graph, we see that the travel supply nurses is much higher than the residential nurses because they're taking residential nurses and pushing them to be travel nurses. And if we're losing our residential nurses, we're just increasing the labor shortage. And so over here, we see that the traveling nurse is probably the most beneficial job to have, but people with families and other health issues where they don't want to leave, they just don't want to travel, they are going to feel this effect, and they aren't going to be as appreciated and get the right amount of attention and not attention, but work they deserve. So additional factors that have impacted the labor shortage of nursing, the canceling of elective surgeries has also been a huge problem in just the revenue of hospitals. Increased wait time, scheduling, and emergency. This has led to increased costs for the hospitals and damaging to patients, not only their physical health, but mental health. And there was a survey done also that said an extra 10-minute wait time sitting in the emergency waiting room can cost the hospital up to $6,000. So if we had sufficient staff, then we would be able to reduce these wait times and deliver the care that we need to. Additional personal protective equipment has also been a huge barrier, as we know from masking issues throughout COVID. But especially the hospital, they have to pay for that and force that upon it. And the last thing is that the vaccine mandate is also predicted to have additional complications to the labor shortage, especially in rural communities where people don't believe in the vaccine and making it mandated for all. So all in all, the economic model provides support of how we could have prevented these issues before COVID. And when we get into deeper research, we'll probably be able to show that a little better. But all in all, it's essential for policymakers to understand the needs of the healthcare system, while the healthcare system also understand business. It's kind of the basis for my major in general too. They both need to work together because neither are going anywhere. So questions?
Thank you so much for all of that. That was incredible. That's such a massive problem. I've seen so much about it online. But there is a lot that goes into it. So thank you for organizing it so nicely. It was so easy to follow it. It was really nice. So anybody have any questions?
First of all, one caveat on questions. No one should feel they can't ask a very difficult question, because we're gonna give Ally the ability to just point at Ben. Field it. Right, and if Ben can't do it, Grandpa's sitting right next to him, we're gonna have to help out.
You want me to point at you?
Except that I can put one of these All right, it's back to you.
You analyze the nursing and the shortage of nursing, and you limit, this is suggested also, so you limit yourself to the COVID. But there are a lot of reasons why the shortage of nurses in the US. Like, I don't know whether, like first the aging population.
Yeah.
In the, and also there is the shortage of schools that they give education to nurses.
Mhm.
So there is not enough nurse educators.
And the nurse education is so rigorous and a lot of people can't even take it.
And many nurses are going to retire almost. I think that between now to 2030 going to be 1 million nurses out. So you may add all these factors to affect, because the COVID is just one event.
Yeah.
Before and after, and it will help a lot. Your papers will be good.
I think you did a great job, Ally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did I notice that some states had a surplus, like New Hampshire? Is that, what would cause a surplus of nurses in a state, or is New Hampshire people just refusing to admit that they're sick?
I think it might
Let's
be,
look into that.
that's where we're trying to look at the travel nurses too, because I think maybe that could have been an issue if they send so many nurses to one place and then they're like overwhelmed and then they have to send them elsewhere.
Look, this was in your 2030 forecast one.
Right.
Did you want to go back to that slide?
yeah.
2030, so he can.
Oh, projected, okay,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
Oh, shoot. Yeah,
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to say like really excellent presentation, and one suggestion is there are like 100,000 school nurses, and so another thing that we could have done is we could have redeployed those school nurses when we shut down the schools to like local areas.
yeah, that's, I didn't even think about that.
I think that was done.
It was.
And then if you want, there's some data on this from the NTPS, so this is the National Teacher Principal Survey.
Yeah, just as an aside, there were some articles out there that she's pulled and we've looked at that said they did redeploy some health professionals out of educational places to try to handle it, but it's like, that's just another temporary fix, because we have to put you back in school, because we're still dealing with this.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm also looking to, I'm doing a survey with my health science class and eventually in the upcoming semesters, it's in development right now, but we want to actually interview some nurses and see like their thoughts on what could we have done to improve how they felt during COVID. And just, I think the biggest thing, my biggest recommendation for what I'm reading, I'm obviously not a nurse, I can't say firsthand, but I just think that they didn't get enough support in their own like hospital business. They didn't feel recognized, they didn't feel like their mental health mattered as much as everyone else's.
So, really good job. I liked your presentation. Although I have to say that, so you said that part of this was to try and like plan for, like what we could have done in advance. I think a big problem is that nobody would have listened even if we did try. Like half the country is still refusing to admit that like there's a problem.
Yeah.
So I think in addition to just looking at what the problem is, we need to come up with better ways to like get people to actually hear the problem, which is not on you, but.
Her suggestion is the policymakers could have predicted this.
I have no faith in our policymakers.
Well, it's because they didn't pass labor economics in Ben's class. So that was the point,
What
when the
exactly is
economic
the
tool
qualification to be a policymaker?
existed, that you could have projected certain problems happening from existing literature, you know, pre-COVID literature.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's
And
true.
being able to try to mitigate this up front. And so her premise is that you need this better inclusion, which is really her major, of understanding these two theories at the same time. So you can, I mean, it's like business people are doing projections all the time, right? And then they're changing their budgets, which is what you tell me. And she's like, well, you guys in the others can do the same thing.
I agree, Ali, you did a great job. I'm really looking forward to seeing your final presentation at the end of this. Really interesting example, I think, of kind of the dynamics in real time of the labor market and how it functions. One of the things I was wondering about, this goes beyond obviously the empirics you've done, but is whether there are aspects and findings from this nurse labor market that are generalizable to other sub-markets in healthcare, or whether there's things that are unique about the market for nurses that mean it's not generalizable. What do we see with physicians and PAs and other kinds of things? I realize it'd be kind of speculative just on your part.
Yeah, no, it would make sense, like, we'd have to probably look a little deeper.
Are you pointing at me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, so this is a particular labor market, but I think the implications and the economics that we brought in are generalizable to really any labor market. Like I was talking with Joe the other day, and really the way I see this is almost like it's a 4-sector labor market. You've got rural nurses, you have urban nurses, and you've got rural non-healthcare workers, and you have urban non-healthcare healthcare workers. And essentially between these 4 markets, you have a lot of things moving.
Right.
And so the travel nurse is one way that we saw a lot of rural nurses moving into cities, or vice versa, because it overcomes a lot of these sorts of problems. But I think that's what you would see in a lot of other labor economics models too, is you have to have like a utility equalization between the sectors. And essentially here what we've got is a really, really important sector that applies those models.
No, and traveling nurses are a great response to that need. I mean, that's what you would expect to happen in a market. I was thinking about it even in terms of the policy implications. It would certainly have more powerful policy implications for the future if these results were more generalizable to other aspects of the healthcare market. Otherwise, if we're looking at a pretty idiosyncratic market, the question is, okay, to what extent can you generalize those into policy implications for the future? And I don't know the answer to that, but that was the line of my question.
Yeah, we picked nursing because like she said, it's the backbone of healthcare. And of course, her one professor's a nurse and was like more than excited to hear what she was finding. But like Ben was saying, at the hospital, nursing support staff was going away because I could get paid more money to make the donuts at Tim Hortons than I could in the hospital, who was paying more than I could in the secondary or the rehab place. And there's this whole domino effect of beds. And so what Ben is talking about was something else we discussed on the next stage, like rural healthcare. And we could have put a slide up, here's the state of rural healthcare pre-COVID, and it just got worse, but it was more complicated than looking, I think, at the nurse market to kind of get the main point across to people. But because then we said, okay, now we have just not 2 graphs to show you. And when we talked about the matrix on that, it got really big.
Yeah.
Now, Peter got excited about the matrix, but nobody else got excited about the big matrix.
Do you have statistics about the gender distribution, and also that for a while there was a lot of imported nurses, like from other countries to find, do you have any that can affect in terms of gender, because when you have gender.
Actually, there was in the American Medical Association, the one they just released, it's called Pulse on the Nation Assessment of Our Nation's Nurses. And they do state that like female versus male, they have the demographics in there. Females obviously a little bit higher, so I think nursing is a more female dominated occupation. So I think that's probably where they're getting the majority of their answers. But also they did say that age was probably one of the biggest effects on burnout, because the nurses fresh out of school, this isn't what they were prepared for. And so they are like, I'm gonna find something else to do, and they just leave.
So I think, in terms of like the generalizability of other sectors, one thing that you could say is that there are close to 4 million nurses in the US, and so even if what you find here doesn't generalize, it's still important.
Yeah.
Because this represents like a significant fraction of the US workforce. The second point too is, within the healthcare system, you can also talk about the production function of health services. And so one of the things that I found really illuminating about your paper is that you mentioned that a shortage of beds doesn't actually mean there aren't beds, there aren't people to staff the beds. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't fully appreciate, that we have the physical capacity, but not the human capital capacity as well too. And so like even emphasizing that makes the studying of the nursing even more important, right? Like if, for example, like there's the doctor ratios were not the constraining factor, but the nurse ratios was the constraining factor. So like that could be something that you can do research. The third thing is the census runs a national sample survey of registered nurses, and it's been running that since the 1970s to the present. So that could be a source of data that you can use to look at how supply and demand balances of nurses across space have changed over time. And perhaps there were other like health spheres like in the past where you could almost use those as like case studies to say like, what have they done? There's a fourth thing, sorry. There was a comment over here about, what policymakers have even listened. And there's now a growing set of like research around like what kind of avenues do policymakers listen to. So I have a colleague who is an economist, Autumn Rao, who did a survey where they randomly sent information about various interventions to policymakers in Brazil to see like what kinds of messages worked. There was someone else too, who's a graduate student of ours, who did some work looking at different types of evidence, whether it's like evidence from a randomized controlled trial or evidence from like an observational study. So you could probably like link into those literatures too, to say like what kinds of evidence would you be able to distill from this, so that you can move the policy needle. And I can send Ben like links to those like, data sets.
All right, I think we have time for another question if anybody has one. All right, well, thank you very much.